August 15, 1945. Victory over Japan Day. Sirens wailed across the American mainland. Ticker tape rained down from office buildings in New York and Chicago and San Francisco. Millions of Americans poured into the streets, crying and laughing and embracing strangers, celebrating the end of the bloodiest war in human history. In prisoner of war camps from California to Georgia, thousands of Japanese soldiers and civilians prepared for the long journey back to their defeated empire. The war was over. They were going home. But in a small facility near Fort Lewis, Washington, something extraordinary was unfolding. When American officers informed a group of Japanese women prisoners that arrangements were being made for their repatriation, several of them responded with tears. Not tears of joy, tears of anguish. They did not want to go home. They wanted to stay with the enemy. To understand why these women chose to remain on enemy soil rather than return to their homeland, we need to go back 9 months to a prisoner camp in the dead of winter, to a Christmas Eve that would change everything, and to a slice of apple pie that shattered every belief they had ever held. This is the story of how enemies became family, of humanity triumphing over hatred, and of the women who made a choice the world would never forget. If you want to understand how mercy can exist in the heart of war, stay with me. This story deserves to be remembered. November 1944, Fort Lewis, Washington. The military transport trucks rolled to a stop before the iron gates of a small detention facility nestled among the pine forests of the Pacific Northwest. Autumn rain had already turned to early snow, dusting the compound in white silence. 45 women descended from the vehicles. They wore the remnants of khaki service uniforms, some still bearing the cherry blossom insignia they had once displayed with such pride. Their faces held a mixture of defiance and profound exhaustion that comes only from those who have lost everything except the will to keep breathing. These were not ordinary prisoners of war. They were members of the Japanese Women's Volunteer Labor Corps, known in Japan as Joshi Teishintai. Young women who had served the empire in administrative and support roles, captured during the final chaotic months of the Pacific Campaign fighting on various islands as American forces advanced toward the Japanese home islands. Clerks, translators, communications operators, women who had believed they were serving a noble cause. Now they stood on American soil as prisoners, facing an uncertain future in a country they had been taught to despise. Among them was Yuriko Tanaka, 23 years old, former signals operator from Yokohama. She had joined the Corps in 1943, believing she was fulfilling her duty to protect her family and homeland. Her father, Tanaka Hiroshi, had been an English teacher at a secondary school in Yokohama. He had died of tuberculosis in 1943, just before she enlisted. But his English lessons remained with her, words and phrases that might now be the only thing keeping her alive. Yuriko clutched a small silk pouch against her chest. Inside was a photograph of her parents and her younger brother Takeshi, 19 years old, conscripted and sent to an unknown destination 8 months ago. No one had heard from him since. The photograph was the only tangible link to the life she had known. Everything else was gone. Standing beside her was Sachiko Yamamoto, 27 years old, former administrative clerk from Osaka. Sachiko had lost her husband at Guadalcanal 2 years earlier. He had been a naval officer killed during the fierce fighting in August 1942. She received the telegram on a Tuesday morning. By Wednesday, she had decided that her life no longer held meaning. She joined the volunteer corps partly from genuine patriotism and partly because she had nothing left to lose. She expected that capture would mean a quick death, perhaps a merciful end to grief that never seemed to diminish. Instead, she found herself standing in the snow alive and uncertain whether that was a blessing or a curse. And Keiko Nakamura, 21 years old, former translator from Hiroshima. She had learned English at school because her father believed foreign languages would open opportunities in the future. Her family still lived in Hiroshima, her parents, her 2 younger sisters. She had written to them every week during her service, and they had written back with news of home, of neighbors, of the small daily events that made up ordinary life. She had not received a letter in 4 months. The silence terrified her more than any enemy. If you are finding value in this story and want to hear more accounts from World War II that most history books never covered, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Stories like this deserve to be remembered. Captain Helen Bradley stood at the gate of the compound watching the women descend from the trucks. 34 years old, from Boston, Massachusetts. She was one of only a handful of female officers assigned to prisoner operations in the Pacific Northwest, chosen for this assignment because someone in the War Department believed women prisoners should be supervised by women officers. 4 months earlier, she had received a telegram that changed everything. Her younger brother James, 24 years old, had been killed at Saipan during the fierce fighting in July 1944. He had been a Marine, part of the force that took the island after weeks of brutal combat. He never saw the victory he helped win. The grief was still raw and immediate. Part of Helen wanted to hate these women, to see them as complicit in her brother's death and the deaths of so many American boys who would never come home. Part of her wanted them to suffer the way she was suffering. But when she looked at their faces, she did not see monsters. She saw young women who seemed just as lost and frightened as she felt. Women who were someone's daughters, someone's sisters, someone who deserved a chance to live. The contradiction tore at her heart. How could she hate them and pity them at the same time? Standing beside Captain Bradley was Sergeant Thomas McCarthy, 32 years old, from Chicago, Illinois. Tall and broad-shouldered, with cold blue eyes that never left the prisoners as they formed lines for processing. McCarthy had reason to hate. His two younger brothers, Patrick and Michael, had died in the Philippines. Patrick died during the Bataan Death March in April 1942, beaten and starved by Japanese soldiers during the brutal forced march that killed thousands of American and Filipino prisoners. Michael survived the march but died in a Japanese prisoner camp 6 months later, wasted away by disease and starvation, while his captors looked on without mercy. Their mother never recovered from receiving 2 telegrams within 6 months. She died in 1943, her heart giving out under the weight of grief that no parent should ever have to bear. In McCarthy's mind, the Japanese had killed her too. Now he stood guard over Japanese women, watching them line up with their few possessions, and every face he saw was the face of someone who had killed his brothers. Every breath they took was a breath his brothers would never take again. His hands clenched at his sides. He did not hit the prisoners. He did not shout at them. He did nothing that violated the rules of the Geneva Convention. But the hatred radiated from him like heat from a fire, visible to anyone who looked closely enough. The women noticed. They learned quickly to stay out of his way. But they also noticed something else, something that contradicted everything they had been taught about Americans. No one beat them. No one tortured them. The barracks were clean and heated against the autumn chill. Meals arrived with predictable regularity, simple but adequate portions of food that, while unfamiliar, were not deliberately insufficient. The guards were professional, even distant, but not cruel. This unexpected treatment created its own form of psychological torture. The women had prepared themselves for suffering, for proof that their propaganda had been true. They had been taught that American soldiers were brutal savages who would show no mercy to their enemies. They had expected rape and beatings and starvation. Instead, they found themselves in a strange space between worlds where the enemy refused to behave like the enemy. It was profoundly disorienting. The first days were marked by rigid silence. The Japanese women maintained strict discipline among themselves, speaking only in hushed conversations during meals. They followed camp protocols with mechanical precision, lining up when told, eating when told, sleeping when told. Their faces were carefully composed masks that revealed nothing of the turmoil within. Yuriko lay awake most nights on her narrow bunk, listening to the quiet sobbing of other women who thought darkness would hide their tears. She heard Sachiko crying 2 bunks away, muffled sounds of grief that seemed to have no end. She heard Keiko whimpering in her sleep, calling out names that must have belonged to her family in Hiroshima. They had all been taught that capture meant dishonor worse than death. They should have fought to the last breath. They should have taken their own lives rather than fall into enemy hands. That was what honor demanded. That was what Japan expected. But they were alive, and they did not know what to do with that fact. Sachiko found the kindness almost unbearable. She had expected capture to mean a quick death, perhaps a merciful end to the grief that had consumed her since Guadalcanal. Instead, she found herself trapped in a routine of meaningless days, neither alive nor dead, neither free nor destroyed. The camp routine was structured, but not harsh. Morning roll call at 7, followed by breakfast in the mess hall. Work assignments that included laundry duties, kitchen assistance, and maintenance of the barracks. Lunch at noon, then afternoon work periods, or supervised recreation time in the small yard. Dinner at 6, evening roll call at 8, lights out at 9:30. It was monotonous. boring. But it was also strangely safe in its predictability, and that safety felt like betrayal. How could she feel safe in the hands of the enemy? How could she accept food from the people who had killed her husband? The questions haunted her through sleepless nights and empty days. The first crack in the wall of silence came in late November as autumn rain turned to heavy snow. Corporal George Hayashi arrived at the facility on a gray morning, his boots crunching through fresh snow as he approached the main gate. 26 years old, from Sacramento, California. A Nisei second-generation Japanese-American born to immigrant parents who had come to America seeking a better life. He had been assigned to the facility specifically because of his language skills. His parents had spoken both English and Japanese at home, and he had grown up fluent in both languages. He could serve as translator for the medical staff, for the administrative officers, for anyone who needed to communicate with the prisoners. He represented everything the Japanese prisoners had been taught to despise. A man of Japanese blood who had chosen to serve the enemy. His own story was more complicated than they could know. When the war started, Hayashi's family had been sent to the Manzanar internment camp, locked away with over 100,000 other Japanese Americans who had committed no crime except being born to Japanese parents. They lost their home, their business, their place in the community they had helped build. They lost everything except each other. George volunteered for military service from inside the camp. He joined the famous 442nd Infantry Regiment, the most decorated unit in American military history, made up entirely of Japanese Americans fighting to prove their loyalty to a country that had imprisoned their families. He fought in Italy and France. He was wounded at Anzio. He earned medals that he never wore because the pride felt hollow when his parents were still behind barbed wire. Now he served as a translator, caught between two worlds that both rejected him. The Japanese prisoners saw him as a traitor to his blood. Some American soldiers saw him as the enemy, despite his uniform. He understood the complexity of divided loyalties better than anyone in that camp. He began by simply greeting the women in Japanese during morning roll call. "Ohayo gozaimasu," he would say. "Good morning." His accent carried the slight California inflection that marked him as foreign despite his fluent vocabulary. At first, the women refused to acknowledge him. They turned their faces away as if his very existence was an insult to their heritage. A Japanese man in an American uniform was an abomination, a creature who had betrayed everything that made him Japanese. But Hayashi was patient. He had faced prejudice from both sides of this war. He understood the time needed to break through walls built from propaganda and fear. McCarthy watched him with undisguised contempt. "I do not trust anyone with Japanese blood," McCarthy told him directly on the first day. "Blood is blood. You might wear our uniform, but you are still one of them." Hayashi did not react. He had heard those words his entire life. He had learned to let them pass without leaving wounds, or at least wounds that showed. The incident that changed everything happened on a cold December morning. Hayashi noticed Keiko Nakamura shivering violently during roll call. The temperature had dropped overnight, and her thin uniform jacket provided little protection against the bitter wind sweeping across the compound. Her lips were turning blue. Her whole body trembled with cold that seemed to reach into her bones. Without a word, Hayashi disappeared into the guards' quarters. He returned 2 minutes later carrying a heavy wool blanket, olive green military issue, the kind that kept soldiers warm in foxholes across Europe and the Pacific. He approached Keiko slowly, holding out the blanket with both hands in a gesture that was almost ceremonial. He moved carefully as if approaching a wounded animal that might flee at any sudden movement. Keiko stared at him with wide, confused eyes. Her entire body tensed, as if preparing for some kind of trick or trap. This had to be a test. This had to be some cruel game designed to humiliate her. But Hayashi simply placed the blanket over her shoulders and stepped back. "Winter here is harsh," he said quietly in Japanese. "Please stay warm." Keiko's hands came up reflexively to clutch the blanket. For just a moment, her carefully maintained composure cracked. Tears welled in her eyes before she blinked them away fiercely, forcing them back through sheer will. She gave the smallest bow, a gesture so brief that anyone not watching closely would have missed it entirely. Just a slight inclination of her head, lasting perhaps half a second. But Hayashi saw it, and he understood what it meant. It was an acknowledgement of shared humanity, the first tentative step across the gulf that separated them. The first crack in the wall. McCarthy saw it too. He approached Hayashi after roll call, his face tight with anger. "That was my blanket," he said. I did not give you permission to take it. I will replace it, Hayashi replied calmly. That is not the point. The point is you are giving our supplies to the enemy. She was cold. She is a human being. McCarthy stepped closer, close enough that Hayashi could see the veins standing out in his neck. My brothers were human beings too, and the Japanese let them die in agony. They starved and beat American prisoners while we are giving these women blankets and hot meals. Does that seem right to you? Hayashi had no answer for that. He knew what had happened at Bataan, at the prisoner camps in the Philippines and China. He knew the cruelty that the Japanese military had inflicted on those who fell into their hands. But he also knew that answering cruelty with cruelty would not bring McCarthy's brothers back. It would only create more pain, more hatred, more destruction. She is not the one who killed your brothers, Hayashi said finally. She is just a woman who got caught in something bigger than herself. McCarthy's jaw tightened. For a moment, Hayashi thought he might throw a punch. But instead, McCarthy just turned and walked away, his boots leaving angry tracks in the snow. The tension between them would continue for months. But something had shifted in that moment. A line had been drawn, and everyone in the camp knew which side they stood on. Word of the blanket incident spread through the barracks that night. The women whispered about it on their bunks, trying to reconcile what they had witnessed with everything they had been taught about Americans, and especially about Japanese who served them. Yuriko lay awake thinking about the blanket, about the careful respect in Hayashi's gesture, about the way he had spoken to Keiko in their own language, not with mockery, but with genuine concern. She thought about her brother Takeshi, who would be about Hayashi's age if he had survived the war. Would her brother have shown such kindness to an enemy? Would she herself have done so before her capture? She thought about her father, the English teacher, who had always believed that language was a bridge between peoples. He had taught her English not because he loved America, but because he believed that understanding could prevent conflict. He had been wrong about that, perhaps. The war had come anyway. But maybe he had been right about something else. Maybe understanding could heal what conflict had broken. The questions kept her awake long after the barracks fell silent around her. In the first week of December, a civilian woman began visiting the camp as part of a church outreach program. Dorothy Mitchell was 52 years old from Seattle. She had gray hair pinned neatly in a bun and blue eyes that held a sadness so deep that those who look it closely could recognize it immediately. Her only son, Robert, had died at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. He was a sailor on the USS Arizona, one of the hundreds of young men who perished in the first minutes of the attack that brought America into the war. He was 22 years old. He had his whole life ahead of him. For 3 years, Dorothy had lived with grief that never fully subsided. She had considered joining the war effort in various ways, but nothing felt right until her pastor suggested the prisoner outreach program. "Why would I want to help the enemy?" she had asked. Because the pastor replied, "Perhaps it is the only way you will find peace." Dorothy was not sure she believed that, but she was also not sure she could continue living with the bitterness that was eating her from the inside. So she came to the camp, not with love, not with forgiveness, just with curiosity. She wanted to see the faces of the people who had killed her son. The first time Dorothy encountered the female prisoners, she stood in the doorway of the recreation room and watched them in silence. They sat in small groups, some reading books, some sewing, some simply staring out the window at the falling snow. They were younger than she had imagined. Many were barely older than Robert had been when he died. Yuriko looked up and caught Dorothy's eye. For a moment, the two women stared at each other, each trying to read something in the other's face. Dorothy saw a young woman with intelligent eyes and a guarded expression. Not a monster, just a young person caught up in something bigger than herself. Yuriko saw an older woman with sorrow etched into every line of her face. She recognized that grief. She had seen it in the mirror every day since her father died. Neither spoke during that first encounter. But something had been communicated, a silent acknowledgement that both sides carried wounds that the war had inflicted. December arrived with heavy snow that blanketed the compound in white silence. The approaching holidays created tension among the American staff who struggled with how to observe Christmas and New Year while overseeing enemy prisoners. Some felt it would be inappropriate to celebrate. Others felt that abandoning their traditions would mean the enemy had won something they should not have. Captain Bradley consulted with her superiors and made a decision that would prove transformative. She would allow a modest celebration, not as a reward, not as a sign of weakness, but as a recognition of shared humanity during a season traditionally devoted to peace on earth and goodwill toward all. McCarthy objected strenuously. He went to Bradley's office and made his case with barely controlled fury. "This is an insult to every American who died fighting these people," he said. "My brothers starved in Japanese camps while we are going to give these women turkey and pie. Do you understand how wrong that is?" Bradley looked at him for a long moment before responding. "Sergeant, I understand your pain. I lost my brother at Saipan 4 months ago. I know what it feels like to hate, but we are not them. We do not treat prisoners the way they treated ours. That is what makes us different. That is what makes us better." McCarthy did not respond. He just turned and walked out, slamming the door behind him. The celebration would proceed, and no one could predict how it would change everything. But before Christmas arrived, something else happened. Something that would test everything the women believed about themselves and their captors. Letters began arriving from Japan. The International Red Cross had been processing correspondence for months, and now the delayed mail was finally reaching the prisoners. Letters from family. Letters from friends. Letters that carried news of a homeland that no longer matched anything the women remembered. Yuriko received a letter from a neighbor in Yokohama. Her hands trembled as she read the cramped characters describing how American firebombing had destroyed most of their neighborhood. Her family's house was gone. Her parents had evacuated to the countryside, but her brother Takeshi had been conscripted and sent somewhere unknown. No one had heard from him in 8 months. The neighbor's final paragraph struck like a physical blow. She wrote that many in their community now questioned whether the war had ever been justified, whether the sacrifices demanded of them had served any purpose beyond the ambitions of military leaders who remained safe while ordinary families lost everything. Sachiko's letter came from a cousin in Osaka. The city had been reduced to rubble by repeated bombing raids. Food was scarce to the point of starvation. People were eating tree bark and grass to survive. The unity and purpose that had defined Japanese society during the early war years had dissolved into desperate individualism. Trust between neighbors had evaporated. Keiko received no letter at all. She had family in Hiroshima. She had heard nothing from them since before her capture. The military had restricted travel and communications in and out of the city for reasons no one understood. The silence suggested possibilities too terrible to contemplate. She spent long hours sitting alone in the barracks, staring at nothing, her face empty of expression. Yuriko and Sachiko tried to talk to her, but she barely responded. She was sinking into a dark place that no one could follow. The women gathered in small groups to share and discuss their letters, their voices hushed and strained. They had been taught that Japan was winning the war, that American victories were temporary setbacks, that the homeland remained strong and united in resolve. Now they confronted evidence that contradicted every aspect of that narrative. Their country was not strong but broken, not united but fragmenting, not winning but clearly losing in ways that would leave scars for generations. What had they been fighting for? What had they sacrificed everything for? The questions had no good answers. And Christmas was coming, bringing with it something none of them could have predicted. If you want to know what happens on Christmas Eve, when the enemy brings a gift that no one expected, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. The story of a slice of apple pie that shattered everything these women ever believed is coming next. And remember, even in the darkest moments of history, there are those who choose kindness over cruelty. This is their story too. The smell hit them before anything else. Roasted turkey, gravy simmering in metal pans, fresh bread still warm from the oven, and something else, something sweet and spiced that none of them could identify, but all of them noticed. December 24th, 1944, Christmas Eve. Snow fell softly outside the windows of the mess hall, covering the compound in a blanket of white that seemed to muffle all sound from the outside world. The Japanese women filed into the mess hall at 6 o'clock as usual, expecting the standard fare of rice and vegetables and whatever protein the kitchen had managed to acquire. They took their seats at the long wooden tables, keeping their eyes down, maintaining the silence that had become their armor against this strange captivity. But tonight was different. Tonight the tables were covered with white cloths, real plates instead of metal trays, forks and knives arranged with care, and at the center of each table, a small vase holding a sprig of evergreen, the only decoration the camp could provide, but somehow enough to transform the bare room into something almost festive. Yuriko sat between Sachiko and Keiko, her hands folded in her lap, watching the American staff move around the room with a strange energy she had not seen before. They seemed almost nervous, as if this meal mattered to them in ways that went beyond simple nourishment. Captain Bradley stood at the front of the room. She wore her dress uniform pressed and clean, and when she spoke, her voice carried a warmth that Yuriko had not heard before. Tonight, the captain said through Corporal Hayashi's translation, "We share a meal together. In America, Christmas Eve is a time for family, for peace, for remembering what matters most. You are far from your families. So are many of us. But tonight in this room, we are not captors and prisoners. We are simply people sharing a meal." The words hung in the air. Some of the women shifted uncomfortably, uncertain how to respond to kindness from the enemy. Others kept their faces blank, refusing to show any reaction that might be interpreted as weakness or gratitude. But Yuriko noticed something in Captain Bradley's eyes, a sadness that mirrored her own. The captain had lost someone too. Yuriko could see it in the way she held herself, in the slight tremor in her voice when she mentioned family. Perhaps they were not so different after all. The kitchen staff began bringing out the food. Turkey appeared first, golden brown and glistening, carved into thick slices that steamed in the cold air. Then came bowls of mashed potatoes, rich and creamy, green beans cooked with bacon, bread rolls still warm enough to melt butter, gravy boats filled to the brim. The women stared at the abundance before them. This was not prisoner food. This was a feast. Sachiko sat frozen, her hands gripping the edge of the table. She had not eaten a meal like this since before her husband died. The last time she had seen such plenty was at their wedding reception in Osaka, when their families had gathered to celebrate a future that would never arrive. Tears pricked at her eyes, but she forced them back. She would not cry in front of the Americans. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. But the tears came anyway, sliding silently down her cheeks as she stared at the food she could not bring herself to touch. Keiko sat motionless beside her, showing no reaction at all. Since the silence from her family in Hiroshima had stretched into months, she had retreated into herself so completely that sometimes Yuriko wondered if she was still there at all. She ate when food was placed before her. She slept when lights went out. But the light in her eyes had gone dark and nothing seemed to reach her anymore. Yuriko reached under the table and took Keiko's hand. The younger woman's fingers were cold, limp, unresponsive. But Yuriko held on anyway, hoping that human touch might anchor her to a world she seemed determined to leave behind. If you are finding value in this story and want to hear more accounts from World War II that most history books never covered, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Stories like this deserve to be remembered. The meal progressed in near silence. The women ate slowly, carefully, as if the food might disappear if they moved too quickly. Some took small bites, testing each dish with suspicion before allowing themselves to enjoy it. Others ate mechanically, consuming the nutrition without tasting the flavor. But all of them noticed something strange happening inside themselves. The food was good, not just adequate, but genuinely delicious. Someone had taken time to prepare it properly, to season it with care, to present it with attention to detail that went far beyond the requirements of feeding prisoners. This meal was a gift, and gifts from the enemy were dangerous things. McCarthy stood in the corner of the mess hall, arms crossed, watching the scene with barely concealed disgust. He had refused to participate in the celebration, refused to sit at any table where Japanese women might be seated nearby. He had eaten his dinner earlier alone in the guards' quarters, a cold sandwich that he barely tasted. Now he watched them eat his country's food, use his country's dishes, sit in warmth while his brothers had died cold and hungry in camps where the Japanese showed no mercy. The injustice of it burned in his chest like fire. He caught Hayashi's eye across the room and held the gaze, letting his contempt show plainly. Hayashi looked away, first turning his attention back to his translation duties. But McCarthy noticed that Hayashi's hands were shaking slightly, and he took grim satisfaction in knowing that his hatred had found its mark. Then the dessert arrived. The kitchen door swung open and staff members emerged, carrying trays laden with something that made the entire room fall silent. Pies. Dozens of them. Golden brown crusts with lattice tops, steam still rising from the gaps between the pastry strips. The smell of cinnamon and cooked apples filled the air, sweet and warm, and utterly foreign to every Japanese woman in the room. They had never seen anything like it. Sergeant James Brennan, a young man from Iowa with a farmer's tan still visible on his forearms, despite months away from home, stepped forward with a wide smile on his face. American apple pie, he announced in broken Japanese that Hayashi had taught him. Christmas tradition. We share with Tomodachi. Friends. He had called them friends. The word landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples through the room. Murmurs arose among the women. Some looked offended at the presumption. Others looked confused. A few looked almost hopeful, though they quickly masked the expression. Captain Bradley had made a deliberate choice about how the pie would be served. Rather than having guards distribute slices to each table, she invited the women to come forward themselves and take a piece. It was a small gesture of trust, an acknowledgement that they were not animals to be fed, but human beings capable of making choices. Yuriko was among the first to approach the table. She studied the pie carefully, noting the intricate lattice pattern on top, the way the filling bubbled slightly at the edges, the scent that reminded her somehow of autumn festivals back home, even though the specific smells were completely unfamiliar. In Japan, desserts were delicate, subtle, designed to please the eye as much as the tongue. This was something else entirely. Bold, generous, unashamed of its sweetness. She accepted a slice on a plain white plate along with a fork that felt awkward in her hand after months of eating with chopsticks or fingers. She returned to her seat and cut a small piece, bringing it to her mouth with careful deliberation. The moment the pie touched her tongue, something shifted inside her. The sweetness was unlike anything in Japanese cuisine. Less refined than their traditional sweets, but somehow more abundant, more generous. The apples were soft but not mushy, holding their shape while releasing their flavor. The crust was buttery and crisp, flaking apart at the touch of her fork. The cinnamon added warmth that spread through her chest like comfort itself. But more than the taste, it was the gesture that overwhelmed her. This was not prisoner rations. This was not the minimum required by international law. This was food meant to bring joy, to celebrate, to share with people who mattered. Someone had taken time to make these pies. Someone had mixed the dough and peeled the apples and rolled the crusts and woven the lattice tops. Someone had done this work not for themselves, but for prisoners, for enemies, for people they had no obligation to treat with anything beyond basic necessity. Why? The question echoed in Yuriko's mind as she took another bite, then another. Why would they do this? What did they want in return? She looked around the room and saw other women having similar reactions. Sachiko sat with her slice of pie untouched for several long minutes, staring at it as if it might reveal some hidden truth. Her husband had loved sweets. He would bring her wagashi from the shop near their apartment in Osaka, small delicate confections wrapped in paper the color of cherry blossoms. She had not eaten anything sweet since his death. The idea of pleasure felt like betrayal. But the pie sat before her warm and fragrant, asking nothing and offering everything. When she finally took a bite, the tears she had been fighting all evening broke free completely. They streamed down her face, silent and unstoppable, dropping onto her plate and mixing with the cinnamon filling. She made no sound, no movement to wipe them away. She just sat there, eating pie and crying, mourning something she could not name. The woman beside her, Keiko, had not moved at all. Her slice of pie sat untouched, growing cold. Her eyes stared at nothing. Her hands lay limp in her lap. But then Sachiko reached out with trembling fingers and touched Keiko's shoulder. Just a light touch. Just a moment of connection between two women who had lost everything. And something flickered in Keiko's eyes. Not much, just a spark quickly extinguished. But it was there. She picked up her fork. She cut a small piece of pie. She brought it to her mouth. She did not taste it. She did not react. But she ate it, and that was something. That was survival, however mechanical. Yuriko watched them both, feeling tears prick at her own eyes. They were not crying because the pie was good. They were crying because kindness, unexpected and unearned, can break something inside you that hatred never could. Corporal Hayashi stood near the door watching the scene unfold. He had grown up eating his mother's apple pie, a recipe she had learned from American neighbors who welcomed his immigrant family, despite the prejudice they faced from others. Those neighbors had brought casseroles when his father was sick. They had celebrated his high school graduation with a party in their backyard. They had written letters to politicians when his family was sent to Manzanar, demanding justice for loyal Americans who had done nothing wrong. His mother had baked apple pie in the camp kitchen whenever ingredients were available. She called it an act of defiance. They could take her home and her freedom, but they could not take her American identity. She was both Japanese and American, and apple pie was proof that both could exist in the same person, in the same heart. Now watching these Japanese women experience apple pie for the first time, Hayashi understood what his mother had been trying to teach him all along. Food could be a bridge across impossible divides. A slice of pie could say things that words could never express. And sometimes the simplest gestures carried the greatest power. He noticed McCarthy leaving the mess hall, pushing through the door without looking back. The sergeant's face was tight with emotion that Hayashi could not read. Anger, certainly, but perhaps something else too, something that looked almost like grief. McCarthy stood alone in the falling snow, letting the cold bite at his exposed face. He could still smell the pies from inside. The sweet cinnamon scent drifted through the gaps in the building, following him out into the darkness. His brothers had probably smelled nothing but decay and death in their final days. They had probably dreamed of food while their captors let them starve. And here he was watching the enemy eat pie. He thought about Patrick, the older brother, who had taught him to throw a baseball. Patrick, who had protected him from bullies in their Chicago neighborhood. Patrick, who had written letters home full of jokes and optimism right up until the end. He thought about Michael, the baby of the family, always laughing, always dreaming of the future he would never have. Michael, who had wanted to be a doctor. Michael, who had died in a camp where Japanese guards watched prisoners waste away without lifting a finger to help. Tears froze on McCarthy's cheeks before they could fall. He did not wipe them away. He let them freeze, their evidence of a grief that would never heal. But somewhere deep inside him, in a place he would never acknowledge, a question formed. A dangerous question. A question that threatened everything he believed about enemies and justice and revenge. If Americans could show kindness to Japanese prisoners, what did that say about the kindness that might have saved his brothers? What did it mean that his country chose mercy while theirs chose cruelty? He pushed the question down, buried it beneath layers of hatred and pain. But it was there now, planted like a seed in frozen ground, waiting for spring. After the meal ended, something fundamental had changed in the camp's atmosphere. The rigid silence that had characterized the first month began to crack. Women who had previously avoided eye contact with guards now offered small nods of acknowledgement. During work details, some began attempting English phrases they had overheard, their pronunciation hesitant, but their effort genuine. The pie had done something that months of adequate treatment could not. It had proven that the kindness was real, that it came from genuine human feeling, rather than mere compliance with regulations. Yuriko found herself drawn to the small camp library, a corner of the recreation building, that housed perhaps 200 books in English. She could read basic English from her school studies, though her vocabulary was limited. She began selecting children's books, simple stories with pictures that helped her understand words she did not know. She thought of her father, the English teacher, who had always believed that language was the key to understanding. He had taught her grammar and vocabulary with patient dedication, never knowing that his lessons would one day help his daughter survive captivity in a foreign land. She missed him with an ache that never faded, but she honored him by continuing to learn by using the gift he had given her. Captain Bradley noticed her in the library one afternoon and brought her a Japanese-English dictionary that had been gathering dust in the camp office. The cover was worn and the pages yellowed, but it was complete and functional. For learning, the captain said simply, placing the volume on the table beside Yuriko. Yuriko looked up at her, this woman who had every reason to hate her, and saw something she had not expected to find. Recognition, not as enemy to enemy, but as one human being acknowledging another. "Thank you," Yuriko said in careful English. It was one of the first English phrases she had used voluntarily since her capture. Captain Bradley nodded and turned to leave, but then she paused at the door. "My brother," she said quietly, not looking back. "His name was James. He died at Saipan in July." Yuriko did not know how to respond. What could she say? "I am sorry that my country killed your brother. I am sorry that we are on opposite sides of this war," but Captain Bradley did not seem to expect a response. She simply left her footsteps echoing down the hallway, leaving Yuriko alone with the dictionary and questions that had no good answers. January 1945 arrived with bitter cold and news that shattered whatever hope the women had managed to hold on to. More letters came from Japan. The Red Cross had processed another batch of correspondence, and the news they carried was worse than before. Yuriko received a second letter from her neighbor in Yokohama, written in November. American bombers had returned. More of the city had burned. Her parents were still alive in the countryside, but food was running out. People were dying of hunger and cold. And still no word of Takeshi. The neighbor wrote that most young men conscripted in his group had been sent to Okinawa, where a great battle was expected in the spring. Okinawa. Yuriko knew what that meant. If the Americans were planning to invade Okinawa, her brother would be among those defending it. The chances of survival were slim. She held the letter against her chest and closed her eyes, trying to picture Takeshi's face. 19 years old. Still a boy in so many ways. He used to make her laugh with his impressions of their teachers. He used to bring her wildflowers from the fields near their home. She might never see him again. Sachiko's letter came from a different cousin, one who had fled Osaka for the countryside. The cousin wrote that Sachiko's in-laws had both died in the bombing raids. The family home where she had spent her wedding night, where she had dreamed of raising children with her husband, was nothing but ash and rubble. There was nothing left of the life she had known, nothing left to go back to. For the first time since Guadalcanal, she felt something other than grief. She felt free, horribly, terribly free. The chains of obligation and expectation that had bound her to Japan were gone, burned away with the house and the in-laws and all the plans that would never come true. She did not know yet what this freedom meant, but she felt its weight, its terrifying possibility. Keiko received another letter this time, but what it contained was worse than silence. The letter came from an aunt who lived in the mountains outside Hiroshima. She wrote that she had been trying for months to contact Keiko's family in the city, but all communication with Hiroshima had been cut off. The military had restricted travel. Mail was not being delivered. No one could enter or leave without special permission that was never granted. The aunt did not know if Keiko's family was alive or dead. She only knew that they had vanished behind a wall of military secrecy, unreachable and unknowable. But she held on to hope, the aunt wrote. Perhaps they had been evacuated. Perhaps they were safe somewhere. Perhaps the silence meant nothing except the chaos of war. Keiko read the letter 3 times, then folded it carefully and placed it beneath her pillow. She clung to that hope like a drowning woman clinging to driftwood. Her family might still be alive. The silence might mean nothing. She had to believe that. But the uncertainty was its own kind of torture, a limbo that offered neither peace nor closure. She lay down on her bunk and turned her face to the wall. She stayed like that for 3 days. Yuriko and Sachiko took turns sitting with her, bringing food she would not eat, speaking words she did not acknowledge. They were afraid to leave her alone, afraid of what she might do in the depths of despair that had swallowed her. On the 3rd night, Yuriko woke to find Keiko's bunk empty. Panic seized her heart. She threw off her blankets and searched the barracks, finding nothing. She ran outside into the snow, ignoring the cold that bit through her thin sleeping clothes. She found Keiko standing at the fence, staring out at the darkness beyond the compound. Her feet were bare in the snow. Her breath came in small white clouds that vanished into the night. Keiko, Yuriko called softly, approaching slowly. Come inside. You will freeze. Keiko did not turn around. I do not know if they are alive, she said. Her voice was flat, empty, dead. My family, I do not know anything. And the not knowing is worse than knowing. Yuriko stopped a few feet away, unsure whether to reach out or keep her distance. I know, she said. I have lost people too. My father. Perhaps my brother. I understand. Keiko turned her head slightly, just enough to look at Yuriko over her shoulder. Do you understand what it means to have nothing? To be nothing? Yuriko did not have an answer. She did not know if anyone could understand another person's grief or if sorrow was always ultimately alone. But she stepped forward anyway. She took off her jacket and wrapped it around Keiko's shivering shoulders. She put her arm around the younger woman and held her, sharing what warmth she had. You are not nothing, Yuriko said. You are here. You are alive. And I need you to stay alive. Sachiko needs you. We are all we have now. Keiko stood rigid for a long moment. Then slowly she turned and buried her face in Yuriko's shoulder. She did not cry. Perhaps she had no tears left. But she let herself be held, let herself be warmed, let herself be pulled back from whatever edge she had been standing on. They stayed like that until the guards found them and brought them back inside. No one asked questions. No one punished them for being out after curfew. Even McCarthy, who was on duty that night, said nothing when he saw them being escorted back to the barracks. He just watched with those cold blue eyes, and something flickered in them that might have been understanding or might have been memory. He too knew what it meant to lose everyone. The weeks that followed were a slow transformation. The women began to emerge from their collective grief, not because the pain had lessened, but because survival demanded movement. They threw themselves into the camp routine with renewed purpose, finding meaning in small tasks that had previously felt meaningless. Yuriko spent hours in the library, working through English books with increasing fluency. She started helping other women with their letters, translating between Japanese and English, bridging the gap between prisoners and captors. Sachiko discovered a talent for organization that had been dormant during her years as a wife. She began helping in the camp kitchen, suggesting improvements to meal preparation, teaching American cooks how to prepare rice properly. The kitchen staff welcomed her expertise, and she found satisfaction in being useful. Keiko slowly returned to life. She did not speak much, but she began participating in camp activities again. The medical officer, Dr. Robert Hayes, noticed her careful attention when she observed him treating minor injuries among the prisoners. He began allowing her to assist with basic tasks, changing bandages and organizing supplies. She had gentle hands and a steady presence that seemed to calm anxious patients. And Dorothy Mitchell kept visiting. She came every week now, sometimes more often. She brought books and writing paper and small gifts that the prisoners were allowed to keep. She sat with the women during recreation time, practicing simple English phrases with those who wanted to learn. One afternoon, she sat across from Yuriko in the library, a cup of tea between them that someone had made from hoarded supplies. "My son Dorothy," said, pointing to a small photograph she had brought. "Robert. He died at Pearl Harbor." Yuriko looked at the photograph. A young man in naval uniform smiling at the camera with the confidence of someone who believed he had endless time ahead. He looked kind. He looked like someone who would have been a good friend, a good husband, a good father if he had lived long enough. "I am sorry," Yuriko said in careful English. "War is bad for all." Dorothy nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "War is bad," she agreed, "but people can be good, even enemies." She reached across the table and took Yuriko's hand. Her grip was warm and firm, the grip of a mother who had lost her child and somehow found the strength to keep loving. "I was so angry," Dorothy said. "When Robert died, I wanted to hate all Japanese people. I wanted you to suffer the way I was suffering." She paused, searching for words. "But hate is exhausting. And Robert would not want me to spend the rest of my life bitter and angry. He was not that kind of person." Yuriko felt tears sliding down her own cheeks. She did not try to stop them. "My father," she said haltingly, "he teach me English. He believed language make bridge between people. He died before I come here. But his teaching saved me now." Dorothy smiled through her tears. "Your father was wise, and so are you." They sat together in silence after that, two women from opposite sides of a war, holding hands across a table, proving that connection was possible, even in the darkest times. March 1945 brought spring to the Pacific Northwest and rumors of war's end to the camp. American newspapers available in the library carried stories of island after island falling to Allied forces. Japanese cities burned under waves of bombers. The homeland that the women remembered was being systematically destroyed, reduced to ash and rubble by a military machine that showed no signs of slowing. Yuriko read the newspapers with growing despair. She had stopped hoping for Japanese victory months ago. Now she simply hoped that someone she loved might survive the destruction. She thought about Takeshi on Okinawa, where the great battle was now raging. The newspapers described it as the bloodiest fighting of the Pacific War. Casualties on both sides were staggering. The Japanese were fighting with desperate determination, knowing that Okinawa was the last barrier before the home islands. Every night she prayed for her brother's survival. Every night she prepared herself for the news that he was dead. In April, Captain Bradley organized another meeting to prepare the women for what everyone knew was coming. "The war will end soon," she told them through Hayashi's translation. "Germany has already surrendered. Japan cannot continue much longer. When it ends, arrangements will be made for your repatriation." The word repatriation hung in the air like a question mark. Repatriation meant going home. But what home? The cities were destroyed. The families were scattered or dead. The country they had served no longer existed as they remembered it. After the meeting, Sachiko approached Yuriko in the barracks, her face troubled. "What if we do not want to go back?" she asked quietly. "What if there is nothing left to go back to?" Yuriko had been thinking the same thing, but she had not dared voice it aloud. To even consider not returning felt like the ultimate betrayal of everything they had been raised to believe. "I do not know," she said honestly, "but we have time to think about it. The war is not over yet." But even as she spoke, she knew that time was running out. Soon they would have to make a choice that would define the rest of their lives. Stay with the enemy who had shown them mercy, or return to a homeland that might no longer want them. If you want to know what happens when Japan surrenders, when these women must choose between past and future, subscribe to the channel. The story of the decision that changed everything and of the legacy that lasted 75 years is coming next. And remember, sometimes the hardest choice is not between good and evil, but between two impossible options. This is the story of women who found the courage to choose. August 6, 1945, a date that would divide human history into before and after. The news arrived at the camp in fragments, pieces of information that did not make sense until they were assembled into a picture too terrible to comprehend. A single bomb had destroyed an entire city, not a bombing raid with hundreds of planes, not waves of incendiaries dropped over hours. One bomb, one explosion, one moment of light brighter than the sun, and then nothing but ash and shadow where a city of 300,000 people had stood. Hiroshima. Corporal Hayashi stood before the assembled women, his face gray, his hands trembling as he held the translated bulletin. He had been ordered to inform them of the news, but the words seemed to stick in his throat, refusing to emerge. This morning, he finally said in Japanese, "A new type of bomb was dropped on the city of Hiroshima. The entire city has been destroyed. Casualties are estimated in the tens of thousands, perhaps more." He paused, swallowing hard. "We do not yet have information about specific areas or survivors, but the destruction appears to be total." Silence filled the room. A silence so complete that Yuriko could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Then Keiko stood up. She rose slowly from her seat, her movements mechanical like a puppet controlled by invisible strings. Her face showed no expression. Her eyes stared at nothing. "Hiroshima," she said. The word came out flat, empty, stripped of all meaning. "My family is in Hiroshima. My mother, my father, my sisters." No one moved. No one breathed. "They are in Hiroshima," Keiko repeated. "They are in Hiroshima. They are in Hiroshima." She kept saying it, the same words over and over, as if repetition might change their meaning, might somehow transport her family to safety, might undo what had already been done. She had clung to hope for months. Hope that the silence from her family meant nothing. Hope that they had been evacuated. Hope that somewhere behind the military's wall of secrecy, they were safe and waiting for her return. The atomic bomb erased that hope forever. If anyone had survived the months of uncertainty, they could not have survived this. Then her knees buckled. She collapsed like a marionette with cut strings crumpling to the floor in a heap of limbs and grief. Yuriko was the first to reach her, dropping down beside her, pulling her into her arms. Sachiko followed a moment later, wrapping her arms around both of them. The three women huddled together on the cold floor, while around them the other prisoners began to weep. Not just for Keiko's family, for all of Hiroshima, for all of Japan, for a world that had just witnessed something that should never have been possible. McCarthy stood at the back of the room watching. He had wanted the Japanese to suffer. He had dreamed of it, prayed for it, spent 3 years nurturing his hatred like a flame that could never be allowed to die. His brothers had died in agony, and he had wanted the enemy to know that same agony. But not like this. Not women crumpled on the floor keening with grief. Not an entire city erased in an instant. Not civilians, children, families who had never held a weapon, never killed an American, never done anything except be born in the wrong country at the wrong time. He thought about his mother, who had died of a broken heart after losing her sons. He thought about the mothers in Hiroshima who would never have the chance to grieve because they were already ash. His hands clenched at his sides. His jaw tightened until his teeth ached. This was not justice. This was not revenge. This was something else entirely, something that had no name in any language he knew. He turned and left the room without a word. If you are finding value in this story and want to hear more accounts from World War II that most history books never covered, Take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Stories like this deserve to be remembered. 3 days later, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki. The news arrived with less shock this time, not because the horror was any less, but because the capacity for shock had been exhausted. The women received the information in numb silence, adding it to the weight of grief they already carried. Yuriko spent those days at Keiko's side, barely leaving her for more than a few minutes. Keiko had stopped speaking entirely after her collapse. She ate when food was placed before her. She slept when exhaustion overcame her. But she did not respond to voices, did not acknowledge touch, did not show any sign that she was still present in her own body. The camp doctor, Dr. Hayes, examined her and shook his head. Shell shock, he said quietly to Yuriko. I have seen it in soldiers who witness terrible things. The mind protects itself by retreating somewhere the pain cannot reach. Will she come back? Yuriko asked. Sometimes they do, sometimes they do not. All we can do is keep her safe and wait. Yuriko nodded and returned to Keiko's bedside. She talked to her even though Keiko did not respond. She told her stories about growing up in Yokohama, about her father's English lessons, about the pranks her brother Takeshi used to play. She sang songs their mothers had sung to them, as children lullabies that carried memories of a time before war had stolen everything. On the 5th day, Keiko's hand moved. Yuriko was in the middle of a story about her father's terrible cooking when she felt fingers close around her own. She stopped mid-sentence, hardly daring to breathe. Keiko's eyes focused for the first time in days. They found Yuriko's face and held there swimming with tears that had been trapped too deep to fall. They are gone, Keiko whispered. Her voice was raw, broken, barely audible. My family, my home, everything I was. Yuriko squeezed her hand. I know, she said. I know. What do I do now? How do I live when everything is gone? Yuriko did not have an answer. She had been asking herself the same question for months. But she held Keiko's hand and spoke the only truth she knew. We live because we are still alive. We live because giving up would mean they won. We live because somewhere, somehow, there must be a reason we survived when so many did not. Keiko closed her eyes. Tears slid down her temples and soaked into the pillow. I do not know if I can, she said. Then let me help you. Yuriko replied, let Sachiko help you. We will carry each other until we are strong enough to walk alone. It was not much. It was not enough. But it was something to hold on to in a world that had lost all solid ground. August 15th, 1945. The day the world changed forever. The news came through the camp radio at noon, crackling and distorted, but unmistakable. Emperor Hirohito's voice, thin and formal, speaking words that no Japanese person had ever expected to hear. Japan had surrendered. The war was over. American soldiers erupted in celebration. Gunfire cracked into the air as men discharged their weapons in joy rather than violence. Shouts and cheers echoed across the compound. Someone found a radio and music drifted through the summer air, jazz and swing sounds from a world that had existed before everything went wrong. The Japanese women stood in silence watching. Yuriko felt nothing. Not relief, not despair, just emptiness, a vast hollow space where emotions should have been. She had known this moment was coming. They all had. But knowing and experiencing were different things. The country she had served no longer existed. The empire she had believed in had been revealed as a lie built on propaganda and maintained through cruelty. The future she had imagined had been erased as completely as Hiroshima. What now? The question hung in the air, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. Captain Bradley called a meeting that afternoon to discuss repatriation procedures. She stood at the front of the room, her uniform crisp despite the summer heat, her face carefully composed. But Yuriko could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the weight of months spent supervising prisoners, while mourning her brother, the toll that kindness in the midst of war had taken on her soul. The war has ended, Captain Bradley said through Hayashi's translation. Arrangements are being made for your return to Japan through Red Cross channels. Transport will be organized within the next few weeks. She paused, looking around the room at faces that showed no joy at the prospect of going home. I understand that many of you have concerns about what you will find when you return. The situation in Japan is difficult. Cities have been destroyed. Food is scarce. Many families have been displaced or worse. She took a breath, choosing her next words carefully. But Japan is your home. Your country needs you now more than ever to help rebuild what has been lost. The speech continued covering logistics and timelines and practical matters that seemed impossibly distant from the reality of what these women faced. Yuriko listened with half her attention, the other half consumed by the question that had been growing inside her for months. What if she did not want to go back? The thought was treason. It was betrayal of everything she had been raised to believe. A Japanese person belonged in Japan, served Japan, defined themselves entirely through their relationship to the homeland and the emperor. But the homeland was rubble. The emperor had surrendered, and the only kindness she had known in years had come from the enemy. After the meeting ended, she remained in her seat while the other women filed out. Captain Bradley noticed and approached her, expression curious. "Is there something you need?" the captain asked through Hayashi, who had also stayed behind. Yuriko looked up at her, at this American woman who had lost her brother to Japanese bullets, yet had treated Japanese prisoners with respect and dignity. At the face of an enemy who had become something else entirely. She took a deep breath and asked the question that had been building inside her for months. "Captain Bradley, if some of us do not wish to return to Japan immediately, is this possible?" The room fell completely silent. Hayashi stopped translating mid-sentence, his mouth hanging open in surprise. Captain Bradley's eyes widened, then narrowed as she processed the unprecedented request. "You want to stay?" she asked. Here in America, Yuriko nodded, her heart pounding so hard she was certain everyone could hear it. Some of us have lost everything. Our families, our homes, our country as we knew it. Here we have found something unexpected. Kindness, dignity, a chance to be seen as human beings rather than enemies. She paused, searching for the right words in a language that was not her own. "I am not asking to stay forever. I am asking for time. Time to decide what my life will be now that everything I knew is gone." Captain Bradley stared at her for a long moment. Then she nodded slowly. "I will need to consult with my superiors. This is not a request anyone anticipated, but I will ask." She turned and left the room, her footsteps echoing down the empty hallway. Yuriko sat alone in the silence, wondering if she had just destroyed whatever future she might have had. That night, the barracks erupted in heated discussions. Some women were horrified by Yuriko's question. They saw it as the ultimate betrayal, a rejection of duty and identity that shamed all of them. How could she consider staying with the enemy? How could she abandon her homeland in its darkest hour? Others admitted they had been harboring similar thoughts but lacked the courage to speak them aloud. They gathered around Yuriko, asking questions, seeking reassurance, trying to imagine a future that seemed impossible just hours ago. Sachiko stood firmly beside Yuriko. "What are we returning to?" she asked the room. "Our cities are destroyed. Our families are scattered or dead. The Japan we knew no longer exists. Perhaps it never existed as we believed." She looked around at faces that ranged from angry to confused to hopeful. "I lost my husband at Guadalcanal. I lost my in-laws in the bombing raids. I have nothing waiting for me in Osaka except ghosts and rubble. Here I have found work that gives me purpose. I have found people who see me as a person rather than a servant of the empire." She paused, her voice growing stronger. "I am not rejecting Japan. I am acknowledging that Japan has changed, and so have I. The question is not whether we love our homeland. The question is what kind of life we can build from the ashes." Keiko, who had been silent since the meeting, spoke for the first time. "My family is dead." She said it flatly, without emotion, as if describing the weather. "Hiroshima killed them. I have no one waiting for me. No home to return to. No reason to go back except obligation to a country that sent my father and mother and sisters to die." She looked at Yuriko. "I will stay, if they let us. I will stay and try to find a reason to keep living." The discussions continued long into the night. When morning came, the division was clear. 28 women chose immediate repatriation. They would return to Japan and face whatever circumstances awaited them with courage and dignity. Some had families still alive. Some felt duty to help rebuild. Some simply could not imagine themselves as anything other than Japanese. 17 women, led by Yuriko, Sachiko, and Keiko, chose to request permission to stay. They would accept the uncertainty of building new lives in America rather than return to a homeland that felt more foreign than the country that had imprisoned them. Both choices required tremendous courage. Both choices carried risks that could not be calculated, and both choices would shape the rest of their lives. The response from Captain Bradley's superiors took 3 days. The War Department was uncertain how to handle such an unusual request. Legally, the women were prisoners of war entitled to repatriation under the Geneva Convention. Nothing in international law addressed what to do when prisoners actively requested to remain in captivity. Eventually, a compromise solution emerged. The women would not be permitted to remain as prisoners indefinitely. But those who wished to delay their repatriation could apply for reclassification as displaced persons. This would allow them to remain in the United States temporarily while exploring possibilities for immigration employment and permanent resettlement. However, they would no longer be housed at government expense. They would need to find sponsors, secure jobs, and establish themselves independently in American communities willing to accept former enemy nationals. It was not freedom, but it was a chance. In the weeks that followed, the process of finding sponsors began. Dorothy Mitchell was the first to step forward. She appeared at Captain Bradley's office the day after the announcement, her face set with determination that brooked no argument. "I will sponsor Yuriko Tanaka," she said. "She can live with me in Seattle. I will help her find work, learn English properly, build a life." Captain Bradley looked at her with a mixture of surprise and admiration. "Mrs. Mitchell, you understand what you are offering? She is Japanese. There will be people who will not understand, who will criticize you, who may even threaten you." Dorothy nodded. "I lost my son at Pearl Harbor. I spent 3 years hating every Japanese person on earth. And then I met these women, and I learned that hatred was killing me faster than grief ever could." She took a breath, steadying herself. "My son Robert was a good man. He believed in kindness and second chances. If he were alive, he would be proud of what I am doing. And that matters more to me than what the neighbors think." Dr. Hayes arranged for Keiko to continue her medical training at Seattle General Hospital. He personally vouched for her character and skills, promising to supervise her work until she was ready to stand on her own. Sachiko found employment at a Seattle textile factory through connections made by camp staff who had been impressed by her organizational abilities and attention to detail. One by one, the 17 women who had chosen to stay found paths forward. Not easy paths, not guaranteed paths, but paths nonetheless. And then something unexpected happened. McCarthy requested a meeting with Captain Bradley. He stood in her office, his hat in his hands, looking more uncertain than she had ever seen him. "I want to help," he said. Bradley stared at him. "Help with what, Sergeant? The women, the ones who are staying, some of them still need sponsors or jobs. I know people in Chicago who might be willing to help." Bradley leaned back in her chair, studying him with undisguised curiosity. "Sergeant McCarthy, you have spent the last 9 months making clear that you hate these women, that you wanted them to suffer." What changed? McCarthy was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion he could not hide. "I watched that woman collapse when she heard about Hiroshima. Keiko. I watched her crumple to the floor like her bones had turned to water. And I thought about my mother, who did the same thing when she got the telegram about Michael." He swallowed hard. "I wanted the Japanese to suffer the way my brother suffered. But that woman on the floor was not a soldier. She was just a girl whose family got killed. Same as my mother. Same as me." He looked up at Bradley, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "My brothers were good men. Patrick used to volunteer at the soup kitchen every Thanksgiving. Michael wanted to be a doctor so he could help people. They would not want me to spend the rest of my life hating people who never did anything to them." He paused. "I cannot stop hating what happened to them. But maybe I can stop hating people who had nothing to do with it." Bradley nodded slowly. "That is a start, Sergeant. That is a good start." The final repatriation day was scheduled for September 10th, 1945. The morning arrived gray and cool, a hint of autumn in the air that reminded everyone how much had changed since these women first arrived in the snow of November. The 28 women who had chosen to return to Japan gathered in the yard, their few belongings packed in small bags and boxes. They wore civilian clothes that had been provided for the journey, simple dresses and coats that looked strange after months in the remnants of military uniforms. The 17 who had chosen to stay stood across from them, separated by a gap of perhaps 10 feet that felt like an ocean. No one spoke at first. What could be said? They had shared captivity and grief and transformation. They had watched each other break down and build back up. They had become sisters in a way that blood alone could never create. And now they were saying goodbye, perhaps forever. Captain Bradley stood at the front of the assembled group, her voice carrying across the morning silence. You came here as our enemies. You leave as something we never expected. As friends. As people who taught us that redemption is possible, even in the darkest circumstances. She paused, her voice growing thick with emotion. Those of you returning to Japan carry with you memories of the kindness you received here. I hope you will use those memories to build bridges between our countries, to teach your children that enemies do not have to remain enemies forever. She turned to the 17 who were staying. And those of you who have chosen to remain face a difficult path. America is not always kind to those who look different, who speak different languages, who carry the weight of a war that killed so many of our sons and brothers. But you have shown courage that humbles me. You have chosen to build new lives from nothing, and I believe you will succeed. Yuriko stepped forward, her heart pounding. Captain Bradley, she said in English, that had improved dramatically over the past months. We came here believing we knew what America was. We learned that we understood nothing. She looked around at the faces of women she had lived with, cried with, survived with. We thought Americans were our enemies. We discovered that the real enemy was our own ignorance in the propaganda that shaped our beliefs. Some of us returned to Japan to help rebuild. Others stay here to build new lives. But all of us carry forward the lesson that enemies can become friends when people choose compassion over hatred. She bowed a deep, formal bow that expressed gratitude words could not convey. Thank you for the food, for the shelter, for the dignity, and for the apple pie. A few people laughed through their tears. Even Captain Bradley smiled. The transport trucks arrived. The women who were leaving began climbing aboard, stopping to embrace those who were staying, exchanging addresses and promises to write, holding each other one last time. Sachiko found herself face to face with a woman named Fumiko who had chosen to return to Japan. They had bunked next to each other for 9 months, sharing whispered conversations in the darkness, supporting each other through grief and fear. Write to me, Fumiko said. Tell me about America. Tell me about your new life. I will, Sachiko promised. And you write to me about Japan. Tell me how the rebuilding goes. Tell me there is hope. They embraced, holding tight for a long moment. Then Fumiko climbed into the truck and was gone. Yuriko stood beside Dorothy Mitchell, watching the trucks pull away. The woman who had lost her son at Pearl Harbor and the woman who had served the empire that killed him, standing together as the dust settled behind departing vehicles. Are you ready? Dorothy asked. Yuriko shook her head. No, but I will be. Dorothy took her hand. Then let us go home. If you are finding meaning in this story, stay with me. The years that followed would bring challenges and triumphs, sorrow and joy. And 75 years later, the legacy of these women would bring their descendants together in ways no one could have imagined. The years that followed were not easy. Yuriko moved into Dorothy Mitchell's small house in Saddle, sleeping in the room that had once belonged to Robert. The walls were still covered with his photographs and medals, his high school diploma, and the flag from his memorial service. Dorothy had not changed anything since his death. At first, Yuriko felt like an intruder. How could she sleep in the bed of the son whose death her country had caused? How could she accept kindness from a mother whose grief was partly her fault? But Dorothy refused to let her carry that guilt. Robert died because of decisions made by men in Tokyo and Washington. She said one evening as they sat together on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, "You did not make those decisions. You were a young woman doing what she was told, same as my son." She reached over and took Yuriko's hand. "The war took my son. I will not let it take anything else. Not my ability to love, not my belief in human goodness, not my chance to help someone who needs it." Yuriko found work as a translator for military government offices processing displaced persons and occupation paperwork. Her unique perspective as someone who had experienced both sides of the conflict made her invaluable in bridging cultural misunderstandings. She also continued her education, attending night classes to improve her English and eventually enrolling at the University of Washington. She graduated in 1952 with a degree in social work, determined to spend her life helping others navigate the space between cultures. That same year, she met James Anderson. He was an engineer working on the reconstruction of Japanese infrastructure, a quiet man with kind eyes who had served in the Pacific during the war, but never spoke of what he had seen. They met at a dinner party hosted by mutual friends, two people carrying invisible wounds who recognized something in each other. They married in 1953 in a small ceremony attended by Dorothy Mitchell, Sachiko Keiko, and a handful of others who had become family through choice rather than blood. Dorothy cried throughout the ceremony, not from sadness but from joy. "Robert would have loved you," she whispered to Yuriko afterward. "He would have been so proud to call you sister." Keiko completed her nursing training and worked at Seattle General Hospital for 30 years. She never married. The loss of her family in Hiroshima had left wounds that never fully healed, and she found it difficult to open herself to the possibility of new loss. But she found purpose in caring for others. She specialized in working with patients who had suffered traumatic injuries, using her own experience of grief to connect with those who felt alone in their pain. Hundreds of people owed their recovery to her gentle hands and steady presence. Sachiko married William Foster, a mechanic at the textile factory where she worked. He was a widower with two children who needed a mother, and she was a woman who needed to be needed. Their marriage was practical at first, but grew into genuine love over years of shared meals and small kindnesses. She had three more children with William, raising all five as her own, teaching them Japanese alongside English, making sure they understood both parts of their heritage. And Dorothy Mitchell lived to be 92 years old. She spent her final years surrounded by the extended family that had grown from her decision to sponsor a former enemy. Yuriko's children called her Grandma Dorothy. Keiko visited every Sunday for tea. Sachiko sent flowers on every anniversary of Robert's death. When Dorothy passed away in 1982, she was holding two photographs, one of Robert in his naval uniform, one of Yuriko on her wedding day. Both were her children. Both were her legacy. August 2020, 75 years after the war ended. The National Immigration Museum on Ellis Island unveiled a special exhibition about refugees and displaced persons from World War II. Among the artifacts on display was a small collection from Fort Lewis. Medical records, letters, photographs from 1945. And at the center of the exhibit, a worn cookbook with a handwritten recipe for apple pie, annotated with notes in both English and in Japanese. The caption read, "This recipe was shared between American kitchen staff and Japanese prisoners at a detention facility in Washington State during Christmas 1944. It represents one small act of kindness that changed the lives of all who witnessed it." Standing before the exhibit were two women. Emily Anderson, 60 years old, physician, granddaughter of Yuriko Tanaka Anderson. Catherine Mitchell Thompson, 68 years old, retired teacher, granddaughter of Dorothy Mitchell. They had found each other through genealogy research, discovering the connection between their families that had begun 75 years earlier. They had exchanged emails and phone calls, sharing stories and photographs, piecing together a history that neither had fully understood. Now they stood together, looking at artifacts that told the story of their grandmothers. "My grandmother never stopped talking about Mrs. Mitchell," Emily said. "She called her the mother who chose her when the world wanted to reject her." Catherine nodded, tears sliding down her cheeks. "My grandmother kept every letter Yuriko ever wrote her. They are in a box in my attic. Hundreds of letters over 30 years. She pointed to a photograph in the exhibit. Two women standing together outside a small house in Seattle, one Japanese and one American, both smiling at the camera. "That was taken in 1950, Catherine said, 5 years after the war ended. Look at how happy they are." Emily leaned closer to the photograph. "My grandmother used to say that hate is exhausting, that choosing love takes courage, but gives you something to live for." She turned to Catherine. "I think our grandmothers proved that enemies do not have to remain enemies forever. That kindness can break through walls that seem impossible to breach. That one slice of apple pie can change the course of history." Catherine reached out and took Emily's hand. They started something beautiful, a friendship that lasted their whole lives. "And now we are continuing it." Emily squeezed her hand. "For them, and for everyone who needs to know that redemption is possible." They stood together in silence, two women from different backgrounds, united by a history that had transformed enemies into family. Behind them, other visitors moved through the exhibit. Some stopped to read the placards. Some studied the photographs. Some stood before the cookbook and traced the handwritten notes with their eyes. An elderly man, 96 years old, paused before the display. He wore a cap identifying him as a World War II veteran, one of the last survivors of the Pacific Campaign. He had come to the museum with his granddaughter wanting to see this exhibit before he died. He stood before the artifacts for nearly an hour, reading every word, studying every photograph. When he finally turned away, his granddaughter asked if he was all right. "I was at a camp like that," he said quietly. "I guarded Japanese prisoners. I never thought of them as people, just enemies, just the ones who killed my friends." He looked back at the photograph of Yuriko and Dorothy. But if those women could find friendship across everything that divided them, maybe I was wrong. Maybe I have been wrong for 75 years. He left the museum that day with tears on his cheeks and something lighter in his chest. His granddaughter never learned the full story of what he had done during the war, but she saw something change in him that day, some burden lifted that he had carried for longer than she had been alive. That is the power of this story. That is why it matters. Not because it changes the past. The past cannot be changed. The bombs still fell, the cities still burned, the young men still died on beaches and in prison camps and in the skies over nations they had never seen. But the story changes the future. It shows that another way is possible, that enemies can become friends, that hatred can be transformed into understanding, that the children of enemies can stand together and build something their grandparents could only dream of. The exhibit remains at the museum today. Beside the display case is the photograph from August 2020. Two women holding pictures of their grandmothers smiling at the camera, united by history. Sometimes visitors stand before the exhibit and weep. Sometimes they stand in silence. Sometimes they take photographs to show their children and grandchildren. And sometimes, just sometimes, they leave changed. They leave understanding that the enemy is just a stranger they have not met yet. That kindness costs nothing but can transform everything. That one small act of compassion, one slice of apple pie shared on a cold Christmas Eve, can echo through generations. In 2021, Emily and Catherine wrote a book together. They called it Between Two Flags, a story of mercy across battle lines. It told the full story of Yuriko and Dorothy, of Keiko and Sachiko, of Hayashi, and McCarthy, of all the people who found ways to be human when the world demanded they be enemies. In the final chapter, they wrote, "Our grandmothers never met before the war made them enemies. They lived on opposite sides of the world in countries that had tried to destroy each other. But they found each other in a prison camp in Washington State, and they chose love over hate. They proved that enemies are just strangers we have not understood yet. That redemption is always possible. That the walls we build between ourselves can always be torn down if we have the courage to try." We met 75 years later, continuing what they started. And now we tell their story to the world. Because some stories are too important to forget. Because mercy needs witnesses. And because 3/4 of a century after the war ended, a recipe for apple pie in a museum case still reminds us that even in the deepest darkness, humanity finds a way to survive. If this story has touched you, share it with someone you love. Subscribe to the channel for more accounts from World War II that reveal the hidden humanity of history. And remember this: every morning when you open your eyes, you are receiving a gift that some people almost lost. Do not take it for granted. Every person you meet is carrying a story you do not know. Treat them with the kindness you would want if you were carrying their burden. And every choice you make between hatred and mercy, between revenge and forgiveness, between darkness and light, that choice matters. It echoes forward through generations. It shapes the world your children will inherit. Yuriko Tanaka and Dorothy Mitchell made their choice in a prison camp in 1944. They chose mercy. They chose humanity. They chose each other. 75 years later, their granddaughters stood in a museum, living proof that the choice was worth making. The fragments of that story remain. The recipe endures. And mercy against all odds survives. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering. Until next time.